Hello, everybody. I apologize for the wait. We had some technical challenges. This webinar is going to be in, and if you need, you can caption to any other language or in English. You can just find that at the bottom of your screen. There's a little button saying CC that reads CC, and all you have to do is click on it and choose the language that you want the captioning to be presented in, or in the original language. My name is Sharon Shafrir. I'm a co-founder of the grass movement Hope for Israel Alliance. I'm from Rochester, New York, an Israeli American. And today's presentation is part of a collaboration of Hope for Israel Alliance and Aid Coalition. Hope for Israel Alliance advocates for the people of Israel against anti-Semitism, and most importantly, supports the campaign to release the hostages still held by Hamas. Today, we mark 505 days that we still have hostages in hell, 63 hostages to be exact, and another 4 bodies are expected to be released this week, and we are hoping, and we are really trying to do everything we can to get all of our hostages back. The coalition is a US-based non-for-profit organization that its mission is to strengthen and preserve the democratic foundation of the state of Israel and the spirit of its Declaration of Independence. Since the events of October 7th, Aid Coalition had managed the platform that supports dozens of social projects and organizations like Hope for Israel Alliance, HIA, and we are offering psychosocial support to communities in Israel, such as food kitchens, cultural, etc. In the upcoming 2025 elections to the World Zionist Congress, Aid Coalition is working with various pro-democracy organizations. We are collaborating in only one slate that is not affiliated with any political party or religious movement. Hope for Israel Alliance is on that slate in addition as part of the Aid Coalition. And we are hoping to get involved in the World Zionist Organization. Our single focus is reprioritizing the vast resources of the World Zionist institutions to rebuild Israel, support Israeli communities, and ensuring that these resources are directed where they genuinely need to be. Today, I'm proud Alon Pinkas, diplomat who served as Israel's Consul General in New York, and voice on US-Israel relations, diplomacy, to talk to us about the US relations and Roma. Hello, I think everybody had lost my entire presentation and didn't hear me. So I'm looking at the chat and seeing everybody put any message. No. Any questions, please put in the question mark. Alon, can you hear me?
I can hear you, but you broke up, and I hope I'm not breaking up.
No, you're not breaking up. So I introduced you, and I'm inviting you to join us.
Would you please ask the technical staff, crew, however many you have, if I can see at least some of the people who click their video on it? It helps me to connect in terms of the level of interest or boredom for that.
So unfortunately, this is a webinar and not a Zoom meeting, and therefore we won't be able to see the over 50 people who logged in. Right. So we will start, and people may join us. So shalom, Alon.
Hi, Sharon. Thank you for hosting this. It's a pleasure to be here. I can't see all 50 of you. I can't see any one of you for that matter. But I imagine I hope you could see me with all the technical difficulties. I'd like to divide this conversation more than a webinar. I like to divide it into two, but they're sort of entwined issues. One is, as the headline that Sharon publicized suggests, and that is the evolution of the U.S.-Israeli relationship. Not so much an academic review or outline of the history, although I'll get into that. But you have to understand where it began, and I do promise to get eventually to current affairs without speculating or guesstimating on the future of the relationship, although that's almost ingrained inside the conversation. The second is something that you all care about in terms of your personal, political, ethnic, religious, communal identity as American Jews, and that is the role, how American Jewry came to play a role in this relationship. Now, if you look at the two timelines of the evolution or the development of American Jews as a community inside America and the U.S.-Israel relationship, there is a similarity. The similarity begins with the fact that far from what we see today in terms of the strength of the U.S.-Israeli relationship, the 25 odd years of a sort of an informal strategic alliance, is parallel and consistent with the rise of Jewish political activism and Israel advocacy. But it never started this way, quite the contrary. And let me start, this is where I separate the two timelines before conjoining them again. We always tend to think, because it's a comfort zone of sorts, and because I don't see you, so I don't know what the median age is. We grew up with this relationship, the U.S.-Israeli relationship, as almost a given, a taken for granted, something that's always been there, as if it was, the 11th commandment given to Moses on Mount Sinai. It wasn't. It was, in fact, it was almost the exact contrary. The U.S. was completely indifferent and oblivious to the Zionist idea before the Holocaust, before World War II. After World War II and the effects of the Holocaust, there was a guilt factor at play. But most importantly, from an American point of view, it saw the British dismantle their empire, including mandatory Palestine. And B, even more significant, is the fact that the world was de facto divided into two blocks, an American bloc and a Soviet bloc. And those two blocs were competing in the late 40s for spheres of influence, the Middle East being one of them. In the Middle East, the U.S. was extraordinarily suspicious of the state of Israel. Yes, we can all quote, and we use it in Hanukkah dinners or Pesach Seders, how Truman was first to recognize Israel, but truth be said, he only did it 11 minutes before Stalin did, because it came to his attention that Stalin intends to be the first. And second, if you're familiar with Harry Truman's history and biography, you know that he had a lifelong friend, a business partner, a man by the name of Jacobson in Independence, Missouri, and that man was Jewish, and that man implored Truman to do so, and that man even got Chaim Weizmann into the White House in 1946 and 1947. By the way, parenthetically, Jacobson was never allowed in Truman's home because Mrs. Truman didn't think that it's appropriate that Jews come into her house. Now, this is not, I'm not saying anything about Truman here. What I'm saying is that was the American sentiment, even after the Holocaust. But the U.S., once the partition plan in 1947 was accepted by Israel, well, by the Zionist movement, soon to be the independent state of Israel, and rejected by the entire Arab world in general and the Palestinians in particular, The US became worried that this is going to become an armed conflict, which eventually it did, and even thought of retracting its recognition I'm sorry, let me take that back. Retracting its support for a Jewish state and turning it back to the UN for some kind of trusteeship or dominion or a UN protectorate. The UN was just a fledgling organization. Once the war began, the US was nowhere to be found in terms of its support for Israel. There was minimal support. There was lip service being done, being said. Once the Soviets supported the Arab cause, the Americans said that they support Israel's war effort. And when the war ended, the US turned back and tried to forge coalitions in the Middle East that were based on containing the Soviet Union. That was the basic, the most fundamental, and most important Cold War policy: containment. It was about containing the Soviets, not just along the East-West line in Central Europe and Germany, to be specific, but also in regions, in the Middle East, in Southeast Asia, in the Pacific Rim, even in Central America, and even where communist parties were powerful inside Western Europe. The US between 1949 and 1956 was indifferent and couldn't care less about Israel. Then in 1956, and I said, I'm going to cut short the history, the academic history class, but it's important to understand how this relationship evolved. In 1956, Israel colludes with France and Britain in what we call the Suez War, the 1956 Suez War, in October. That was a month before the November 1956 election. And here was Israel colluding with two colonial powers that the Arabs hate in order to take over the Suez Canal. And Israel, was all of a sudden, in Arab eyes, became synonymous with or complicit with the colonial powers, and the U.S. was livid because that ran completely contrary to U.S. efforts to contain the Soviet Union. So Eisenhower, for the first time ever, and by the way, the last time ever, exerted enormous pressure when an American president exerted enormous pressure on Israel to do something that Israel thought was essential for its own security, and that is withdraw from the Sinai immediately. Ben-Gurion understood the power relations and complied with Eisenhower's request, but that didn't change Eisenhower's, not hostility, but very circumspect, very suspicious attitude toward Israel. When John F. Kennedy was elected, he tried to do the same thing and came to the Arabs with an offer to build a regional alliance, excluding Israel. Luckily for the U.S.-Israel relationship, not necessarily for the region itself, luckily the president of Egypt at the time, a young man by the name of Gamal Abdel Nasser, who took over in a military coup in 1958. Nasser thought of himself, he was somewhat of an egocentric narcissist, and thought of himself as the epicenter of three concentric circles: the Arab world, Africa, and the non-aligned. So for him, any kind of cooperation with the U.S. Would have been a waste of time and ran contrary to his ideas of those three concentric circles. Kennedy waited a year and a half and finally realized that nothing good is ever going to come out for the U.S. Politically in the Arab world, that it needs to maintain a good relationship with then the world's largest oil producer, Saudi Arabia. At least it had the largest oil reserves at the time. Since then, the U.S. surpassed Saudi Arabia by much, as did the Soviet Union, then Russia, its successor, etc. And since the U.S. had a good relationship with the Saudis, going back to FDR meeting the Emir of Saudi Arabia in the Suez Canal in 1945, the U.S. said, okay, we're not going to manage to forge an alliance. So we at least need to hedge our bets and develop a better relationship with Israel. In 1963, JFK met David Ben-Gurion. That, ladies and gentlemen, was the first time ever that an American president met an Israeli prime minister. From 1948, the establishment of the State of Israel, to 1963, no meeting ever took place. Yes, Truman met Weizmann, who later became the president. In fact, he was announced president while in Washington, but that's beside the point. Not only that, but Kennedy hosted Ben-Gurion not in the White House, not to alienate the Arabs, not to make a scene. He hosted him in the presidential suite at the Waldorf Astoria. Until a few years ago, the White House owned a suite at the Waldorf Astoria in New York. By the way, in most of the 80s and 90s, the manager of that hotel was a gentleman by the name of Alon, like me, Ben-Gurion, the grandson of David Ben-Gurion. He was the general manager. But a few years ago, this is all parenthetically just for gossip. A few years ago, the U.S. government sold the suite because, lo and behold, the Chinese bought the hotel. And so now the president, when he's in New York, whomever the president is, stays in a different hotel. Not only did Kennedy host Ben-Gurion for the first time, but he also, for the first time since 1948, offered Ben-Gurion a major weapons system. Until then, Israel had almost zero American military equipment. There were some drawdowns from NATO surpluses that the U.S. threw Israel's way. Nothing that is a game changer on the battlefield. But in 1963, Kennedy decides to sell Israel a Hawk anti-aircraft missile system. That was a big deal. It was a defensive system, yes. But after the Kennedy assassination, when Lyndon Johnson came to the White House, and Johnson was viscerally and sentimentally much more pro-Israeli than either Kennedy, who came from an sort of anti-Semitic background. He was not an anti-Semite, but his father sure as hell was. But he was much more pro-Israeli in his natural proclivities than Kennedy or Eisenhower, or even going back to 1948, Harry Truman. And Israel began negotiating with Lyndon Johnson on the sale of advanced aircraft. And the U.S. stalled. Johnson said he would, but the U.S. stalled. At the time, if you recall, the Israeli military was based on French aviation and British armor. Centurion tanks and Oregon and Mirage jets. Those were their names. In 1966, something extraordinary happened. An Iraqi Air Force pilot, a Christian, there's a Christian minority in Iraq, was fed up with what he believed to be the persecution of Christians in Iraq and some ill treatment and discrimination that his family experienced, and he deserted with a brand new, out of the showroom, as they say, MiG-21, the top of the line of Soviet aircraft industries. The U.S. immediately wanted that plane because, and this is a key factor here that will take us into the next 5 minutes and last 5 minutes in terms of the history, because the U.S. became much more involved and mired in Vietnam. And in Vietnam, you had Soviet-made jets, but you also had, North Vietnam had Soviet-made jets, but also Soviet-made surface-to-air missiles that the U.S. did not know, was not sure how to deal with. And the way to test that would have been to sell Israel those weapons in the event that Israel encounters such battlefield experiences or confrontations with Egypt and Syria. But he still stalled until that gentleman, the Iraqi pilot, deserted, and then the U.S. asked for the plane. Israel said, "Fine, but you need to go, follow through on your promise to sell us jets." And Johnson signed the deal. The jets, by the way, were delivered, a Skyhawk A4 jet and a force multiplier and game changer at the time, the Phantom F4 jet. Those were sold to Israel before 67, but only arrived after 67. But 67 is a watershed year because Israel defeated the two Arab countries that were prized Soviet assets, Egypt and Syria. And the US began to develop a much closer military relationship with Israel, but still relations with Israel were cool. They began to warm up. They began to be more cooperative and more collaborative, but Israel was not regarded by any measure as an ally. There is a parallel development having to do with American Jews. I'll get to in 67. I will get to that in a few moments.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that.
What were you going to ask me?
I was going to ask you about the evolution of American Jews.
Okay, so you know what? So I'll take your advice, Sharon, or your remark here, and I will stop the U.S.-Israel relationship in 1967. We will get back to that in 3-4 minutes, and I'll go to American Jews. American Jews, you who registered for this webinar, are extraordinarily unique in the amalgam or the mosaic of American society, because you are both an ethnic and religious group, as opposed to the Irish who were Catholic and Irish, the Italians who were Catholic and Italian, the Poles who were Catholic and Poles, Jews were Jews and Jews. But also in a much more important way that reflects on their attitude toward Israel. American Jews were the only ethnic group in America since the 1890s, you know, with the beginning of the Irish and then the Italian and the Polish immigration and the Jewish, obviously, to particularly to New York, but also Philadelphia and Boston, the entire Northeast corridor. The Jews were the only ethnic group that did not have an old country. The Italians left Italy. They even reminisced and romanticized about the hills of Sicily and the port of Naples. And the same with the Irish, who sang Irish songs and opened Irish bars, and the Greeks and the Poles. They all had a home country with a family back in the old country, and they came for economic opportunity. Jews didn't have a home country, they fled. Jews fled Poland and Lithuania and Russia and Latvia and Hungary and Romania and Poland, I think I said Poland already, and Germany and Austria, Austro-Hungary. Jews fled. And so until 1948, all Jews wanted to do was Americanize themselves, to be integrated into American society. Yes, they kept communal ties on the basis of religion and ethnicity, but not on the basis of coming from the same place. Because on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, you could have in the same tenement, you can have a Jew from Russia, a Jew from Latvia, a Jew from Russia, and a Jew from Germany. And they were all Jews, something that you didn't have with other ethnic groups. So when the State of Israel was established and immediately called itself the State of the Jews, meaning the state of the Jewish people, and Ben Gurion said it, and every prime minister since has called and defined Israel as the state of the Jews, as he should, because that is the essence of Zionism. Many American Jews were either completely indifferent to this or openly hostile, because Israel all of a sudden became sort of an enterprise that was competing with their attempts to socialize in America. Now, it wasn't real competition, because Israel in the late 40s and into the 50s was a poor, desolate country with very little economic opportunity. And if you happen to live in New York or Philadelphia or Boston or Chicago or Cleveland, for that matter, or Toronto, you moved out of the inner city by the 50s. Israel was still a backwards country, looked by the U.S. and by many American Jews as some kind of a Soviet sympathetic socialist country that builds a weird concept called kibbutz, a collective. That's a kibbutz is a collective, and that was alien to what these Jews had wanted to do. which leads us to 1967. What happened in 1967 is those Jews that were somewhat alienated from this project, this enterprise called Israel, all of a sudden had Auschwitz nightmares all over again. And once Israel was threatened, they felt that they were threatened. And once Israel defeated the Arabs, Egypt, Jordan, and Syria, and an Iraqi expeditionary force, if anyone's counting, once Israel defeated them in 6 days, Jews not only had an old country, a homeland that they've never visited, but they had one that they could be proud of and brag about. And so from 1967, commensurate with, parallel to their integration, their heightened or increased integration into American society, into American institutions, politics, business, banking, Hollywood, what have you, they had an Israel to be proud of. Okay, so that takes care of both lines converging in 1967. By 1970, I go back now to the U.S.-Israeli thing. By 1973, Israel was fighting a major war, 6th of October 1973, and everyone made the obvious analogy to October 7, 2023, in terms of the major surprise, the calamity, the catastrophe, the devastation, and I'm sorry, and however you choose to call it. But after the 1973 war, which began as an intelligence and military debacle, but ended with a limited, but nonetheless significant victory for Israel, the U.S. decided, it was then Richard Nixon in the White House and Henry Kissinger as Secretary of State, the U.S. decided to hedge its bets with Israel on the assumption that the Egyptians, who had already begun in 1972, a year earlier, to disassociate themselves from the Soviet Union, that at some point Israel and Egypt, mediated by the U.S., could reach some kind of a treaty, and that would fit perfectly into containing the Soviet Union, because the Soviet Union was in terms of the military hardware and technology, was defeated on the battlefield, and B, had only one weakened client in the Middle East, and that was Syria. And as a result of this new thinking, reminding you that at the same time the U.S. did, on a much larger scale, a similar thing with Nixon's trip to China. That was a year earlier in 1972, but the idea was that one way of isolating or containing the Soviet Union would be to create all kinds of strange alliances that people least expect the U.S. to do. In the aftermath of 1973, and in 1973 in the war itself, the U.S. rushed to Israel an aerial train of equipment that essentially saved Israel. Immediately after the war, Richard Nixon, who many Jews disliked, and many Jews to this day think for some reason that he was an anti-Semite, which in terms of his upbringing in California and as a Quaker, it's not far from the truth, but he looked at it in very cold realpolitik terms, and he institutionalized foreign military aid to Israel. That is the foundation of the relationship that we know today. And later on, 4 years later, Jimmy Carter, as president, mediated that idea of a peace agreement between Israel and Egypt. And from the mid-'80s, when Israel was introduced as a non-NATO major ally, this relationship has grown almost exponentially, short of a formal defense treaty, short of a formal defense pact, but nonetheless an alliance for all intents and purposes.
So let me ask you this.
Yep.
Some of the things that we hear a lot in our communities is we have shared values. Israel has shared values with the United States.
I didn't even get there.
So I would like to expand on that, because what you're talking about is really realpolitik and geopolitical understanding of the region. And the mantra that we're constantly hearing is values, values. I just want to dive into that.
It's not a mantra, it's true.
Okay.
But that doesn't make us unique. Although we love to think that we're unique in every sense of the word, we're not. The US has shared values with France and Britain far more than it has with Israel. The US has shared values with Canada, I'm putting aside Mr. Trump right now, than it does with Israel. The US has more in terms of shared values with many other countries before Israel even breaks it into the top 10. What you saw here, Sharon, and it's a very good point that you raised, even though I was going to talk about this thing later, but
I'm going to scramble this conversation.
No, that's fine. I'm good with that. I'm good with that. Thank you.
Just want to make sure that we're not, diving into a lecture and having a conversation, because people are asking questions that I would like to address.
Okay. The shared values thing is part of it's actually consistent with what I described in terms of the strategic relationship. It's reverse engineering. Once we developed a strategic partnership with the US against the background of the Cold War and with the providing the US with the needs it had in Vietnam, we started saying, no. This is much deeper. This is much more profound. This is much more important. Look, we are two immigrant-based societies. I put Trump aside for the second time. We are two immigrant-based societies that rose against the course of history, that were established against something. The US against colonial Britain and the taxation and the king decides for the colonialists, and Israel against anti-Semitism, persecution, and statelessness of roughly 2,000 years. In fact, we have a light onto the nation, and the US has its shining city on the hill. It's taken from Jesus. Ronald Reagan perfected it, but nonetheless. And now began a process of building, of reverse engineering and building a foundation of shared interests. Now, it's true. It's true. If you look at, if we share not only biblical values, the Ten Commandments and all that, and the dollar bill does have a Magen David on its back, if I'm sure you know that, and not for nothing, it has a Magen David on its back, on the backside of the dollar bill, but also about democracy. The U.S. was very appreciative and in awe that Israel, despite not being an inherent organic democracy, decided that it will be. Because, Israel didn't have the French Revolution, the American Revolution, or the English Glorious Revolution. The Zionists came from non-democratic political cultures. They came from Austria-Hungary, they came from Russia, they came from Latvia, they came from Lithuania, they came from Romania, and they brought in their brethren from Morocco and Tunisia and Yemen and Iraq and Iran. None of these countries is a democracy, and yet Israel decided to be a democracy. And that was an easy selling point for Israel, and something that the Americans were very happy to accept. And so began a process of relying not just on the strategic tenets of the relationship, but also on shared values. All that until 2023, when Israel sort of backtracked on its liberal democratic foundation. Now, again, I don't want to get into politics. This is not why we're here tonight, or this afternoon in America, to talk about the similarities, the differences between Mr. Netanyahu and Mr. Trump, and how Mr. Trump may not give a damn about what Netanyahu wants to do constitutionally in Israel, but at least throughout 2023, the U.S. raised, it was then the Biden administration, they raised the issue of shared values, and you protested in Rochester and in New York City and in Philadelphia and in Los Angeles and in San Francisco against what he was trying to do to Israeli democracy. And there were calls in Congress, and the American media was filled with the profuse use of the profusely used term shared values, that Israel is reneging on shared values, that Netanyahu is backtracking from shared values. Now, shared values is something that Israel may have less with the United States, but much more with American Jews. And that explains this warrants a completely.
That is very an interesting observation.
Well, you waited what, 40 minutes before you said it's an interesting observation? Nothing I said until now was an interesting observation.
I mean, particularly, this is something that is really interesting to hear.
Yeah, I'll tell you.
Everything you said is interesting. You know that. I told you that yesterday.
Don't take me seriously. Okay. You look at the history, the political history of American Jews. You look where they were most active in, the civil rights movements in the 60s, the women's liberation movement. You look where they were involved in terms of the political values in the arts, in Hollywood, in journalism, in literature, in academia, and you look how they vote. I'm not saying, I'm not advocating for Democrats over Republicans or vice versa, but in terms of the values that Democrats for years, forget now, I'm not talking about now, the values that Democrats advocated for years, there is a reason that 75% of American Jews vote consistently for Democrats. I'm not saying that's going to stay that way, and I'm not saying there aren't valid arguments against that pattern of voting. I'm not getting into that. But in terms of shared values, no two communities are closer than Israeli Jews and American Jews. That, by the way, and again, I promise not to get into politics, Alon, but I'm sort of, it's almost inevitable. That is part of the problem with Mr. Netanyahu. He replaced American Jews with evangelical Christians. God bless them. We love them. I don't care about Armageddon. I welcome Armageddon. However you want to look at it. But he turned his back on liberal American Jews. And by liberal, I mean big uppercase L, capital L. Okay? Liberal Democratic Jews. I don't care if they voted for Mitt Romney or for John McCain. And inside Israel, he didn't start this in his defense, but he certainly amplified and expanded the power of the ultra-Orthodox that do not recognize and are completely, deeply, fundamentally hostile to Reform and conservative Jews, which are 80% of the American Jewish community. And he couldn't care less about this. And when you confront him with the shared values thing, you see, you're losing American Jews, he waves, he dismisses this offhandedly and says, yeah, the Upper West Side liberal Jews, they don't get it. No, well, his Texas friends, the evangelicals, they get it in his mind. But that's where we lost. I didn't say we lost forever, but that's where we were set back. Forget lost, the debate or the narrative on shared values. When Americans decided that the Israel that they are looking at is not the brochure that their grandmother in Boca Raton showed them every year before she gave them $18 to donate to the JNF. It was an Israel that has rabbinical courts, that there is a Orthodox monopoly over all kinds of religious services extended to citizens, where women cannot pray in the Western Wall. I'm not getting into the halacha aspect of this. And then there's the occupation. Israel's perceived, I emphasize, perceived lack of will in the last 15 years to move forward on the Palestinian thing. And that exposes American Jews to all kinds of accusations, to the point, because you raised this, I'm dwelling on it, Sharon, to the point that I was not surprised intellectually, but shocked emotionally, seriously, to hear very, very good, smart, educated, well-to-do Jewish friends in New York point a finger at me and say, after the war had begun, I mean, I'm talking about the last year.
After October 7th.
Absolutely. Point to me and say, Israel has become not a safe haven for Jews, but a source of anti-Semitism. I don't justify anti-Semitism. We need to fight anti-Semitism. I have zero tolerance to pro-Palestinian protesters in Columbia or in Berkeley. You know, they gave all the caveats, but then they pointed a finger at me and said, you know, it's Israel's actions that put us on the defensive, that create anti-Semitism, that create it. Now, I think they're exaggerating, but I can't dismiss this and say there's nothing in it. There is some. I need to at least recognize that this is how they feel. Okay, where do you want me to go back to, or you want me?
No.
Or you want to ask something else?
You know, I do want to ask something. So you did say that Netanyahu had shifted his focus from, like, Israel's focus from American Jews or diaspora Jews to the evangelicals. And my question is, does that create a dependency between Israel and the United States in a way that maybe Israel becomes more of a protectorate, or is it still independent and it's just dependent on the whim of a person?
Look, the you know, everyone rolls on their tongue the Trump is unpredictable and that he's transactional. It's all true, which means
because he too is putting all of his wages on the evangelical.
Yeah, but he doesn't. But he only has a window until November 26th or November 28th. But you know, and the U.S. doesn't need Israel. It's Israel that needs the U.S. Let's not forget for a second that this relationship, however pro-Israel lobbyists want to present this as Israel being some kind of an indispensable asset to the U.S., the relationship is asymmetrical. It always has been. It's probably the greatest achievement of Israel's foreign and defense policy since its establishment, this relationship with the U.S. And that's why I started and went on for so long describing how it evolved, to warn people, not that I think that anyone on this webinar should be warned about this. You're knowledgeable people if you joined this webinar to begin with, but not to take this for granted, because all the indications are, and the dynamics are, that the U.S. is disengaging from the Middle East. And if the U.S. is disengaging from the Middle East, and I will in a moment enumerate why it is doing so, and the signs were there, but Israel conveniently chose to ignore them. But if you add to that the unpredictable and transactional Donald J. Trump, we can find ourselves in 2-3 years without the foreign aid bill. I'm not. By the way, that's not necessarily a bad idea, as long as we get guaranteed access to those weapons systems. But once it's not a law in terms like the foreign aid to Israel, the annual military grant, then a lot of strange things could happen. And that transactional character called Donald Trump, you think he cares about the evangelicals? He cares about the rare earths in Ukraine. He cares about the Panama Canal, and he cares about immigration and woke and what have you. He doesn't care about the Gaza Strip, and he doesn't. Look, a year ago, candidate Trump said that foreign aid, I mean, aside from his lashes at NATO, it's costing us too much. It's not beneficial to the U.S. The Europeans are not investing enough. He then went on to say several times that all foreign aid, all foreign military aid should be a loan. He said that about the Germans. He said that about South Korea. And he most recently, already as president 2 weeks ago, said that about Egypt and Jordan, when the two said they will not take in the 2.3 million Palestinians that he, in his Let's Build a Riviera blurt, said will be moving to Jordan and Egypt. And once they said no, he lost his marbles and said, okay, so I'll stop. Okay, why am I telling you all this? Because on the same token, if he thinks that Israel is becoming an irritant, or that Israel is of lesser significance, or he is convinced by countries that have far more sway on him than Israel does, like the Saudis, like the Emiratis, like the Qataris, then he would sell Israel in a minute. In a minute. And there's nothing anyone on this webinar or the organizations you belong to and contribute to and are active in could do about that if he so chooses to do. And the Republican Party, they will toe the line. I did promise, though, Sharon, to list why the U.S. is disengaging from the Middle East, and it's important to tie this to the beginning of our conversation.
Yes.
There are basically four reasons. The first is, I mentioned containing the Soviet Union about 10 times in the last in the last 45 minutes. And there's no Soviet Union. The Soviet Union since 1992 no longer exists. It disintegrated. Whatever aspirations Putin may have, this is not the Soviet Union. And America's prime objective is not containing the Soviet Union. So allies that were useful in that scheme of things, like Israel, and regions that were central to this, like the Middle East, are of lesser significance, number one. Number two, the U.S. became exhausted after hemorrhaging in what Trump correctly called forever wars in Afghanistan, in Iraq. And if you look at the last 8-9 years, the U.S. did not get itself involved in Yemen, was not involved in the Syrian civil war, did not get active in the war in Libya, did nothing to help Hosni Mubarak, a huge American ally, when he was ousted after 1 million people protested in Cairo. The only thing the U.S. gave up about a decade ago on the Palestinian issue, the last president or the last Secretary of State to be involved were Obama and John, will come to me. And so the U.S. is going out of region, getting entangled in wars in Iraq and Iran is no longer something America is interested in. The third reason is what is called energy independence. Circa 2000, and John Kerry was the Secretary of State. I don't know why the name escaped me. Circa 2012, the U.S. developed what is called energy independence. It means that the U.S. is not only the world's largest consumer of energy, but it is also the largest producer of energy. And independence means that it does not need to import any kind of oil or gas because it has the capacity to manufacture all its energy needs. It doesn't do so because there are environmental issues about fracking in Montana, Dakota, and Utah and California, and because of the pricing system, because it's still cheaper to import. But most of America's imports, if there is a need, will come from Mexico and Canada. And so the U.S. lost what it had defined as a prime vital strategic interest in the late 40s and 50s and 60s, the Arab oil-producing Gulf. Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, the Emirates, and so on. And the last reason is, and this sort of connects to where we are today, is China. What is called the pivot to China. The U.S. is defining China, whether they're right or wrong, I don't want to get into, it's a different conversation. The U.S. is defining China as the greatest challenge in the next 4 decades, according to the official strategic assessment of the Department of Defense, and according to an annual strategic posture published by the White House, 2 publications that any one of you can read. The U.S. developed a spectrum in terms of its relations with China, ranging from competition, moving to challenge, then moving to clash, then moving to enmity, then ending, unfortunately, or hopefully not, in military conflict. All these things do not justify staying in the Middle East. The U.S. had one lingering issue in the Middle East, which it still has, but it remains to be seen how it deals with it, and that is the Iranian nuclear issue or nuclear threat. It thought it dealt with this with the Iranian nuclear deal in 2015, the so-called JCPOA. Then Mr. Trump, in his first term, encouraged heavily by Mr. Netanyahu in 2018, unilaterally withdrew from the agreement, even though the Iranians did comply and adhere letter and spirit with the agreement. You may not like the agreement, but as the agreement was, the Iranians complied with it. And so now we're back to square one with the Iranians because thanks to Mr. Netanyahu, Trump inherited an Iran as close as it ever was to the Middle East. As it ever was to a military-grade nuclear capability. And
Alon, we have a few minutes left.
Okay, go. Questions.
We started a bit, so there's actually your very interesting explanation pretty much covered most of the questions that I prepared for today. But I am asking, based on your estimation, that there's a pretty good chance that Israel will lose its military aid one way or another, and where it would change the way it will be granted. What is the biggest mistake that Israeli leadership is doing when it deals with Washington? Like, what do you think is the most significant thing?
There are several mistakes. They have all been done by Mr. Netanyahu. Prime ministers made mistakes. Prime ministers were too hasty. Prime ministers miscalculated American presidents. No one has consistently done damage to the very structure, the very core foundations of the relationship as much as Mr. Netanyahu. The first thing is that he basically destroyed the so-called bipartisanship.
In Israel?
No, in America.
Okay.
In America, let me explain. Bipartisanship never meant that if you're a Republican and I'm a Democrat, we support Israel in the same way. Bipartisanship meant you may be evangelical and I may be a liberal Democrat, but we both support Israel from different angles. We both love Israel. We both respect Israel based on slightly different, not slightly, based on different values. No, bipartisanship didn't just mean that. Bipartisanship meant that Israel would never do anything to side with a political party in America, to alienate itself from a political party in America, and more importantly, its electorate and its grassroots. And Mr. Netanyahu has done exactly that with the Democrats. Now, I can understand his frustration with liberal Democrats. I can understand his inclination or basic sympathy toward. It began with neoconservatives, then it became evangelicals. Now it's fully fledged MAGA. Fine, that's legitimate, but he is hated, and therefore Israel is criticized by large swath of the Democratic electorate. And what people are saying, oh, well, it's the woke, progressive, radical. No, it used to be that. It's no longer just that. That's mistake number one. Mistake number two is not to be cognizant that those four factors that I mentioned, the fatigue with forever wars, the absence of the Soviet Union, the oil,
the rise of China,
the oil independence, and the pivot to or the reprioritization of American interests toward the Pacific Rim and particularly China, Israel should have repackaged itself and redefined why it is valuable to the U.S. Counterterrorism. That's the U.S. does that with Australia. The U.S. does that with the Philippines. The U.S. does that with France. The U.S. does that with Great Britain, and the U.S. does that extensively with Israel. But you have to find a new way that would allow you, the evangelical Christian, and me, the liberal Democrat from the Upper West Side, as Netanyahu calls it, to allow both of us to coalesce and converge and say we support Israel because of A, B, and C. He made that mistake by inserting himself into the political debate in America. He did it by supporting Mitt Romney in 2012, and he did it by speaking to Congress behind the president's back in 2015 against the Iran deal. He did it by openly confronting Biden, and now he's out of ammunition and he's out of levers of power. Because if there is a confrontation between him or some kind of clash between him and Donald Trump, and that's a very likely scenario. I don't know exactly over what, and I can't tell you that it's going to happen in a week, in a month, or in a year, assuming he's still prime minister. If he does wind up in such a clash, he's got nothing in Washington in terms of playing the political game, because he hedged all his bets on one side and is broadly despised by the other side.
So, Alon, now I'm going to ask you, what are the mistakes, or what should be done by American Jewish or international Jewish leaders?
Yeah.
To
have you ever met a Jew who's not a leader? I mean,
no, you just there's so many stories about Jews, and everybody's a leader.
To meet a bunch of Jews in America, they're all leaders somehow.
But especially American diaspora, that has been very significant in contributing to Israel. Yes. And they have a significant voice in the upcoming World Zionist Organization elections. So what would you recommend leadership, Jewish organizations, the umbrella organizations, do?
Well, it's unavoidable, but you have to start with a philosophical thing. American Jews for many years said there is a limit to how much we can get involved because we don't live in Israel. There's a democratically elected government, whether we like the particular government or not. We don't pay taxes in Israel, and we surely don't send our children to the military, to the IDF. So there's a limit to what we could do. Okay, that was acceptable, and that made sense. No longer. If Israel is indeed the state of the Jewish people, this doesn't mean that you need to leave Rochester and move to Tel Aviv, or that Joe Schmo needs to leave Philadelphia and move to Jerusalem. But if we look at this as a corporate structure, and Israel is the executive committee, and Israel is management, then American Jews are stockholders, and stockholders need to have a say. And those institutions that you're talking about is exactly the arena or the opportunities that they have, the forums that they can make their voices heard. Now, obviously, people have pet issues. For one guy, it's a two-state solution. For another guy, it's religious freedoms. For another guy, it's women's rights. For another guy, okay. Be very specific. Go back to the very basics, and the basics are those shared values. If Israel is seen by you, by anyone else in this webinar or outside of this webinar, as diverging from, veering away from these shared values, call their bluff. Pin them to the wall. Ask them what do they mean when they say halacha states. They are, and American Jews, I mean diaspora Jews, but let's be honest, the vast power demographically, economically, and politically is inside the North American, but mostly the American Jewish community. Is Israel's most important strategic reservoir, not in terms of mass aliyah to Israel. I'm not talking about that, although, prime ministers who tell you that all Jews should come to America, okay, they need to say that. Everyone knows it's a platitude that needs to be said. That's fine. But you need to raise your voice and raise your presence on those issues that you care most about. I'm not here to advise you what these issues should be. you know, the days when you say, oh, well, you know, I live in Cleveland and there's a democratically elected government of Israel. A democratically elected government that doesn't recognize your daughter-in-law because she's wasn't Jewish and she was converted by a Reform rabbi, and so the state of Israel doesn't recognize her as being Jewish, and you're okay with that? Not you.
No, and then by association, her children, your children, won't be recognized.
And her children, according to the halacha, are not. And when her husband said, "The hell with it, I don't want anything to do with it," you have Mr. Netanyahu said, "Oh, you know, liberal Democrat weakling from a rich suburb in Cleveland. Come on, stand up." Because it is, you know, it was artificial in 1948, but now it really is your other homeland. And if you don't stand up, you'll disappear in America. I'm not saying it's a good thing or a bad thing, but the whole idea of Israel and Zionism was not to disappear and blend in because, hey, you know, that didn't work. In Europe,
2,000 years, yes.
Yeah.
Last questions, and we'll wrap up.
Okay.
Where do you think Israel is heading? Where will it be in a couple of years?
If I knew that, I'd be in Las Vegas, not talking to you on a webinar. I'd bet on it.
Okay.
I honestly not. Look, you asked a question. I owe you at least an attempt, not to predict, but to give you a sense. You said 2 years, yes?
Roughly, yes. I think elections are scheduled to be in Israel in 2026. Whether that will be will happen or not.
An election will be held before that. I don't know who is going to be elected. I'm tempted to say Mr. Netanyahu will not be the next prime minister, but I was wrong about him because I thought he would not survive the calamity and catastrophe of October 7th, and here he is, and here we are. And so I'm cautious before making any predictions, particularly given the inexplicable weakness of the opposition in Israel. I mean, it's deplorable how weak and inept they are, and so I wouldn't bet against him. But I think there's just there's a critical mass. His corruption trials, the war, his health, his weak coalition, the ultra-Orthodox conscription law, or the universal conscription law as it relates to the exemption given to the ultra-Orthodox. All this combined, I don't think he will be prime minister a year from now. It's not a prediction. It's just, giving you a sense. In terms of relations with the U.S., it really depends on how callous he is or how careful he is in his dealings with Trump. If Trump is going to, in the next few months, if Trump is going to conclude or will be persuaded by people who have the power of persuasion and sway over him, that Mr. Netanyahu is trying to drag him into a war against Iran, we're going to pay a very, very dear price for that. A, it won't happen, and B, Israel will be punished severely. I don't know how, I don't know when, I don't think it's going to happen, but I'm just making a fair warning. In terms of Israeli society, it's too soon because the Israeli psyche, the zeitgeist, since October 7th hasn't really changed. People, even though they're sort of, they suppressed it and they sort of, it's called in psychology, voluntary dissociation. People are still devastated. People are still agonizing. Those weekly spectacles of the hostages being released, again, pushed up to the surface all these suppressed feelings, emotions, and agony. And so Israeli society needs a period of time to heal from this, which is not October 7th, 2023 was, by any definition, the worst day in Israel's history. It was, in fact, the worst day in Jewish history, going back to the end of World War II. And yet he remains prime minister. Israelis are jaded, tired, resigned, just want to go on with their lives. And so it's very difficult to tell you where we're going to be in 2 years, if there's going to be some kind of a new rebuilding process, a new renaissance. I don't know. I just don't know.
Thank you. Someone asked in the group, in the Q&A, asked to be a little bit more, to repeat what I asked you earlier about the Jews' role, especially in America. And I'll just briefly say, I don't expect you to answer that again. We're wrapping up, and I do want to thank you for your amazing observation and analysis.
So now we're into amazing.
You're taunting me, and you'll pay for it. But
Right.
what I am trying to say for everyone here on the webinar, you don't have to be a Jewish community leader. Step up, bring it up in your congregations, speak to the federation, speak to the people that you are communicating with on a regular basis in your Jewish community, whether it's NCJW, whether it's Witso Women, Hadassah, any chavura, bring it up. You can always reach out to Hope for Israel Alliance. We can create these webinars and invite and have more conversations about it. Be educated, learn about what's going on in Israel, read the news coming from Israel, Times for Israel, for example, and other resources, and speak up if you are truly concerned. Speak up and demand leadership to get involved. For those of you who had missed the introduction, I want to thank Alon Pinkas very much. Your again amazing analysis was just straight to the point. Alon Pinkas is
I also write 3 times a week for Haaretz in English, yet you chose to ask people to read the Times of Israel.
I apologize about that. I, of course, read Haaretz, but Times of Israel also, we had a webinar with one of the analysts, sorry, from Times of Israel. But yes, haaretz.com. Alon Pinkas is a former Israeli diplomat who served as Israel's Consul General in New York and has been a prominent voice on U.S.-Israel relations, Israeli politics, and Middle East diplomacy. And I thank you very much for joining us today. My name is Sharon Shafrir. I'm from Rochester, New York, originally from Israel. I'm the co-founder of Hope for Israel Alliance, HIA, which is a grassroots movement of expats, Israelis. We are pro-Israeli democracy in the spirit of its Declaration of Independence. And this webinar is a collaboration with Aid Coalition, which is a US-based non-for-profit organization that its mission is to strengthen and preserve the democratic foundation of the State of Israel. And we are now collaborating as a slate running for the World Zionist Organization elections this coming spring. More information was provided in the chat. And I thank you all for coming in today. A follow-up email will be sent with the recording of this webinar. Thank you, and good night.